Back in the days when I was mainly shooting with DSLR cameras, the Nikon AF135 f2 DC lens was one of my favorite lenses. The 135mm focal length, fast aperture, beautiful bokeh make that lens a fantastic lens for taking portrait photos, but I also use that lens to take many other kind of photos as well. I've sold that lens when I switched over to use mirrorless camera as my main cameras, but today we have a new 135mm lens here. This is the ZhongYi 135 2.5 lens. The cost of this lens is only a fraction of the price of the Nikon 135mm lens, so let's find out if it is a good, affordable option for people who want a 135mm portrait lens or not. Kia ora, good morning everyone, ZhongYi here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at this new ZhongYi 135 2.5 lens. First of all, I want to mention this is a pre-production sample that ZhongYi sent to me, so there may be a few minor changes or improvement in the final retail version. The ZhongYi 135 f2.5 lens is a full-frame lens that is designed for DSLR cameras. It's available for the Canon EF, Nikon F, Pentax K and also Sony 8 mount. But it's also available for mirrorless cameras for the Canon RF, Nikon Z and also Sony E mount cameras. The sample I received from ZhongYi is for the Nikon Z camera, but optically all the different versions are identical. Because this lens was originally designed for DSLR cameras, so the mirrorless camera version like this Nikon Z mount version is basically the DSLR version but with an adapter or extension tube attached to the end of the lens. So this is to extend the length of the lens to compensate the difference in terms of flange distance. So what it means is it makes the already not very small lens even bigger or even longer. And the weight of this lens is around 850 grams, so it's also not a really lightweight lens as well. This lens is a pure mechanical lens, so there's no electronic features and there's no electronic contacts at the lens mount. The construction of this lens is pure metal and very chunky, very solid kind of metal as well. Holding this lens, it feels very dense and very solid. The front filter thread is 67mm and there's also a metal lens hood that is built on the lens at the front, so you can easily extend it by pushing it out. The main focus ring is at the front of the lens just behind the lens hood. The truffle throw is approximately 135 degrees, which is quite long, but for a fast 135mm focal length lens, it is really needed. And the focus ring itself is very smooth, buttery smooth, and the friction of the focus ring I feel is just about perfect. It is not too stiff and not too loose. If you're wondering whether it may be very hard to manually focus a 135mm focal length lens, yes, the depth of field can be very narrow when you are shooting at the maximum aperture. But because the in-focus area changes very quickly and also very dramatically when you're adjusting the focus, so you can quite easily see whether you are in focus or not. I would even say manually focus a 135mm lens is easier than a 35mm lens, because with a wider angle lens, sometimes it's quite hard to see whether you actually nail the focus or not, because the transition is just not very obvious. This is definitely not the case with this 135mm lens. The aperture ring on this lens has clicks, which I absolutely love it, and apart from the first click which go from 2.5 to 2.8, all the other clicks are 1 click per stop. The minimum focus distance of this lens is 1 meter, and that will give you the maximum magnification of 0.1 times. So it is not really a lens that you could use to take macro photos, but if you are taking portrait photos, you could easily do a headshot which your model's head can easily fill the whole frame. In terms of focus briefing, this ZhongYi 135mm f2.5 lens has surprisingly small amount of focus briefing, which make it really suitable for video filming work. Image sharpness wise, at the maximum aperture f2.5, the center sharpness is already very good. Stop down to f4 would improve the center sharpness only a little bit. The difference is really quite small. The corner sharpness at f2.5 is also very good as well. While stop down the lens would improve the corner sharpness a little bit more compared to the center, overall the lens sharpness, both center and corner, is very decent even when you are shooting at the maximum aperture. With the 135mm focal length and the fast f2.5 maximum aperture, you can easily dissolve the background with this ZhongYi 135mm lens. As a lens that is mainly designed for taking portrait photos, so not surprisingly the bokeh is very nice and very smooth. I noticed when shooting at the maximum aperture, there's a bit of bokeh clipping at the edge and corner of the photo, and that will give you cat's eye bokeh effect. If you don't really like that, then you need to stop down the lens to f4 and then you can get rid of most of the bokeh clipping. Even when shooting at the maximum aperture, vignetting is already at a pretty low level, and once you stop down to f4, then vignetting is almost not noticeable. Lens flare control is really not that good with this ZhongYi lens. When there is a strong light source in front of the lens, you can see lens flare quite easily, and the contrast could also drop quite a bit as well. When shooting at the maximum aperture, you may also see some ring-shaped lens flare when the light source is just outside the frame. Fortunately, stop down slightly to f2.8 would mostly get rid of those ring-shaped lens flare. But yes, overall, lens flare is definitely not the strongest area of this lens, and it could also be a problem when you are shooting at night as well. I remember when I was shooting with my Nikon AF135 DCF2 lens, one of the biggest weakness with that Nikon lens was chromatic aberration. Even though back in those days I was just shooting with a 12 megapixel D700, so it's a very low resolution camera, but I can still see color fringing very easily in the photos that I shot with the Nikon 135mm lens. But with this ZhongYi lens, the chromatic aberration control is surprisingly good. I see virtually no color fringing in my real-world photos. Even a very high contrast test photo like this one, I can only see very minimal color fringing, so that is very impressive. This ZhongYi 135mm lens distortion control is also very good. Even this brick wall test photo, I see virtually no distortion. Starting from around f8, you can start to see Sunstars in the photo. At f8, I think the Sunstars looks okay, but if you stop down all the way to the minimum aperture f22, then you get some pretty nice and pretty sharp 18-point Sunstar. I think it is pretty nice for a lens that is not primarily designed for taking landscape photos. This ZhongYi 135mm f2.5 lens is a very interesting lens. Optically, it's pretty decent overall. It has good sharpness, nice bokeh, almost no chromatic aberration or distortion. However, I really wish the lens flare control is a little bit better, as it could really affect the image quality when there's a strong light source in front of the camera. Unfortunately, the built-in lens hood doesn't really help much at all in terms of lens flare, so you have to be really careful when shooting with a strong light source in front of the camera. Apart from that, my other complaint would be the size of the lens, especially the mirrorless camera version. The size of the lens is pretty big, so yeah, definitely not a small lens or lightweight lens at all. But consider the overall image quality of this lens is pretty decent and the price is only $299. I can accept the limitation of this lens. And if you are a master of photography, you can probably use the lens flare to add some artistic touches to your portrait photos.